Hi everyone, it's Gene Calderon here with Gene Calderon Apologetics Ministries, looking to continue in our theme days. Today being Friday, we will focus on Philosophy Friday. Philosophy is something that people usually avoid because it sounds kind of nerdy, it sounds kind of like a little too deep or just beyond or over my head, but we all practice philosophy. And so what I'm hoping to do is when we take a look at philosophy, which is the ability to think logically and reasonably and come to reasonable conclusions, we have to take our faith seriously enough to make sure that the philosophy of our faith also makes sense. And that's why Philosophy Friday is something that I think is very important and something we ought to practice more, honestly, because I don't see too many people who actually take the time to consider philosophy when it comes to their faith. It's very important. Otherwise, we walk around with this blind faith or this sloppy faith, which we would not be able to defend if we have not thought about it rationally. So that's why Philosophy Friday exists, easy for me to say. But let's take a look at reality. Reality can be complicated and even at times odd. It seems like how do I make sense of this? Because reality is not always neat. Reality is not always obvious, and sometimes, well, many times, it's not what we would expect. But a lot of times in Christianity, what we find is things that we would not make up in our humanity. And so instead, Christianity has that certain kind of twist of real things that real things actually possess. So, for instance, we live in a universe that some would consider to be bad and meaningless, but how do we make sense of that when it contains creatures like us to actually know if it is bad or meaningless? There are two views to these kind of facts. And one of them is the Christian view that looks at this as a good world that has gone bad, but it still holds on to the memory of how things were supposed to be. Or the second point of view is something very similar to what we call dualism, and that is the belief that there are two equal and independent powers behind everything, one of them good and one of them bad, and that the universe is in a constant battle for this endless war of good and evil. But that would mean we'd have to call one good and the other bad. What we would either be saying is that we prefer one over the other and that one of them is actually wrong. But the thing is, see, this is what we would call a preference. And then we'd have to give up talking about good or evil because a preference, or the way we'd look at good, would be what people say we should prefer regardless of what we like. So it would come down to preference and preference alone. And coming to that kind of conclusion, we are now, whether we know it or not, are adding a third thing to these first two. This third thing being the standard by which one of these other two we should prefer. And when we compare these two against it, seeing which one comes closer to it is what we would hopefully say is the good or the better choice. Now, the problem is, what is this third thing? Well, that third thing would have to be the moral standard or the perfection that we're hoping for and looking for. And when we compare these two, both of these two would have to submit to that one third thing that we're unintentionally referring to. And one of these would be closer or more in a right relation with that perfection, that standard, and one would be further away from that perfection or standard. And this is what we would call good, and the one further away is the one we would call bad. Now, what is that standard, that unchanging standard that judges either one? Well, that's what we would call God. That is what we would call the standard, the lawmaker of morality. And this is when we look at two different ideas and we're trying to compare one, it isn't dualism, it isn't two things fighting against each other, because we're looking at them and saying we should prefer one or the other based on a third thing that some people may deny or may say doesn't exist. But then if it doesn't exist, then who cares which one you choose? But because we do know in our hearts that there is something that we measure all things by, and it is standard, it is unchanging, and it is righteous, that we would have to explain as the moral lawgiver or the standard of perfection, and what we call in the Christian worldview, God and God alone. We'll get more into this as we continue in our Philosophy Friday, but the idea of dualism versus theism, the idea that God does exist and is the standard, is what we're comparing here to. And I hope you realize that dualism really does not work, because unintentionally or not, we have to add that third thing in there to be able to measure those by. And so I hope that helps you. Again, this is Gene Calderon with Apologetics Ministries. You can find me here on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, sharing these videos and trying just to help get us to think a little bit. Let us as a Christian community open up our minds and be ready to have discussion and even arguments to be able to defend our faith and make it more rational to ourselves and the world around us. Again, if you're looking to support a missionary, that's what I am with Ratio Christi at Purdue University Northwest in Hammond, Indiana, or I serve at Freedom Church in East Chicago, Indiana, and Lake County Right to Life in Indiana, and just serving the community as any way as I'm able. Thanks to invites, thanks to church partnerships, thanks to group partnerships, I'm able to share a little bit more, and it's always open to anybody in the community. If you'd like to hear more, continue to click on these videos, hit the subscribe, hit the bell, all these different things to let you know when I post a new one of these videos, or invite me over to your church or group or any way that I can possibly serve. It's always my joy, and you'll find me at different events within the community, just serving and hopefully blessing the community with the information that is shared. So God bless you. Thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon. God bless.